it was 50 years ago today, May 4th, 1961, when mixed groups of black and white students took two public buses from Washington, D.C., and intended to arrive in New Orleans 2 weeks later. They were risking their lives to challenge segregation. They called themselves the Freedom Riders. President Obama has issued a proclamation honoring May 2011 as the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides and called on Americans to celebrate their struggle for equal rights during the Civil Rights Movement. Well, in December of 1960, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional segregation in public transportation and interstate bus and rail stations. But despite the ruling, Jim Crow travel laws remained in force throughout the South. 6 months later, a dozen black and white students decided to challenge the local laws of the Deep South and test the commitment of the Kennedy administration to civil rights. A new documentary by the award-winning filmmaker Stanley Nelson tells the story of what happened to these brave students over the next few days and weeks and how they inspired hundreds of others to join the Freedom Rides and eventually succeed in desegregating public transportation. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2010. The documentary, called The Freedom Riders, will air on PBS's American Experience on May 16th. We turn right now to Stanley Nelson, the Academy Award-winning filmmaker, to talk about his film.
In 1961, 12 people, both black and white, decided that they would test the segregation laws of the South by simply getting on buses, Greyhound buses and Trailways buses, and going down south, and the white and black people would sit together at the front of the bus. They would eat together in the restaurants and in the bus stations. The white people would use the colored-only restrooms, and the black people would use the white-only restrooms, and they would just see what would happen to them. And they had no police protection, no army protection, very little press when they started out, and they had no idea that it would really turn into this mass movement.
And so there were talk about the different rides that went down and what happened to each.
Well, the first 12 people were beaten so badly in Anniston and Birmingham that they had to stop. They had to quit.
Let's go to a clip of Freedom Riders.
The door burst open and people just spilled out into the yard. They were practically tripping over each other because they were so sick and they needed to get some air. I can't tell you if I walked off the bus or if I crawled off or someone pulled me off.
When I got off the bus, a man came up to me, and I'm coughing and strangling. He said, "Boy, you all right?" And I nodded my head, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. He had hit me with part of a baseball bat.
People were gagging, and they were crawling around on the ground. They were trying to get the smoke out of their chest. It was just an awful, 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 awful scene.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard.
But then another wave of riders came down from Nashville, who were mostly students in Nashville, and they came down, and they finally, after another riot in Montgomery, got to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were put in prison. They were put in the worst prison in the South, Parchment Penitentiary, which is the prison that we know with the black and white stripes and the chains and the chain gang. And they were put into Parchment, and the governor, Ross Barnett of Mississippi, thought that that would break the back of the Freedom Rides. But then there was a call for more Freedom Riders, and it ended up over 400 Freedom Riders came from all over the country, and they kind of filled up the jails in Mississippi. And finally, the signs in the bus stations and the train stations that said white only and colored only were taken down as a result of the Freedom Rides.
The role of President Kennedy, of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, his brother?
Oh, one of the things that's so interesting about the story is the Kennedys are not the Kennedys that we know later on. You know, they really did not, they wanted to ignore the civil rights movement. They were so focused on foreign policy, and they were really beholden to the segregated South.
It became clear that the civil rights leaders had to do something desperate, something dramatic to get the Kennedys' attention. So that was the idea behind the Freedom Rides, to essentially dare the federal government to do what it was supposed to do. and see if their constitutional rights will be protected by the Kennedy administration.
And the South was voted solidly Democratic, so they were trying as best they could to stay out of the freedom rides, and they were just kept getting backed up and backed up, backed up, to where finally there was this dramatic siege in a church in Montgomery where the Freedom Riders and the local, mostly black community had come for a rally. There were 1,500 people trapped in the church by a mob of over 3,000 people who were setting fires, turning over cars, and finally they were trapped there until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and finally the federal troops were called out, and that was the only way they were saved from the church.
That was the award-winning filmmaker Stanley Nelson, director of the new documentary, The Freedom Riders, which will air on PBS's American Experience on May 16th. I interviewed Nelson last year at the Sundance Film Festival. He brought 2 Freedom Riders with him, Bernard Lafayette and Jim Zwerg. We're going to start with an excerpt from the American Experience film, The Freedom Riders, that features Jim Zwerg.
Students from the movement in Nashville had been through violence. We had been arrested. We'd all had our lives threatened. We were ones that had not broken, and we were the logical ones to continue the ride. Tuesday, May 16th, 1961. We held 2 meetings today. The first was at 6 this morning, the second from 7 to 1 tonight. After much discussion, we decided to continue the Freedom Ride. Of the 18 who volunteered, 10 were chosen, 3 females and 7 males. We will leave on the Greyhound bus tomorrow morning at either 5:15 or 6:45. We were all again made aware of what we can expect to face: jail, extreme violence, or death.
So where did you get on the bus?
We got on the bus in Nashville.
What date?
The 17th. 16th, 17th. I'm getting old again. And as we were getting on the bus, the original plan was we weren't going to rock the boat at all. We wanted to get to Birmingham. We had talked to Reverend Shuttlesworth, and we had attempted to have him have people available to pick us up when we got to the bus station, rather than go in directly and demonstrate. We were going to go out into the community, hope that feelings would calm down a little bit, and then the next morning, prior to getting on the bus to go on to Montgomery, we would go back, and I would use the colored facilities and they would use the white facilities. Well, as we were getting on the bus, Paul Brooks was right ahead of me, and he looked to the back of the bus, and the back was fairly well full already, and he turned to me and said, "Jim, I don't want to sit back there. Will you sit up front with me?" And I said, "Yes." And so from Nashville on, Paul and I were breaking the law. We sat 2 seats behind the bus driver.
Black and white together.
Correct.
Bernard Lafayette, describe this ride. When did your heart start to pump?
Well, when the first group that Jim Zwerg was involved in, they got arrested in Birmingham. Well, we did have 20-some students who were ready to drop out of school in the middle of the exams to go, and I was one of them. But we decided that what we should do is split the group in half, because if all of us go, then we all get arrested or we get killed or something. There wouldn't be a cadre to follow up. So we decided what we'd do is let the first 10 go, and I would be a part of the second group. In fact, I was spokesman for the second group. So when they got arrested in Birmingham, we said, okay, now it's time for us to go. We said, well, wait a minute. Suppose all 10 of us get arrested. So what we did was we divided up. 5 went by car, and the other went by train. And we wanted to rendezvous in Birmingham. But we didn't know in the meantime, while we were on our way down to Birmingham, Bull Connor had taken them out of jail and was bringing them back to the state line of Tennessee. So during the night, we passed each other.
Jim Zwerg, going to the state line, how scary was that?
Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to the state line because when we got to the Birmingham city limits, the bus was stopped and Bull Connors arrested Paul Brooks and myself for disobeying an officer when we refused to give up our seats. I was put in the drunk tank with about 40 various stages of inebriated white Southerners, and so when the others were taken out to the state line, Paul and I remained in jail until the 19th when we went to court. We were found guilty, and when they heard that the buses were going to take us on to Montgomery, we were released.
Bernard Lafayette, talk about when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King got involved with this.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. King came down when we had this mass meeting in Montgomery, when we continued the freedom rides from Birmingham. Martin Luther King got involved when we had the violence at the bus station in Montgomery, and we had the mass meeting at the church, and he wanted to be there to show his support and that kind of thing. That's when Martin Luther King was involved.
Now, you all had asked him to join you on the freedom rides, but he refused. Were you in that meeting?
Yes, I was chairing the meeting. Yes, and some of the students, particularly students who were from other states who had been involved in SNCC, and also who were part of CORE or some other groups, and because they felt that Martin Luther King would give the kind of visibility, and visibility sometimes meant some kind of security and protection, because the media played a very important role. And had it not been for the media, we don't know whether we would have survived physically. And that's one of the reasons why they attacked the media in Montgomery first. I was standing there. They went past us.
And they are? These
are the members of the Ku Klux Klan and other kind of people who were part of some hate groups and that kind of thing.
The police?
No, these were actually citizens.
Right, but also the police's role?
Yes, the policemen sat back and did nothing and allowed them to have about, well, they agreed on 15 minutes to rough us up. And they agreed that they couldn't kill us, but they could beat us up.
They went after the journalists
first. They went after journalists, smashed cameras.
Who were you standing next to?
Yes, I saw a life photographer. There were two of them. One was very tall and young, and the other was kind of short and a little chubby. And they started running, and they were trying to get the camera from the short guy. And I understand this life reporter who was a football player, and he was able to grab the camera and take off. They couldn't catch him at all. But this was at the bus station in Montgomery, Alabama, where Jim Zwerg, was brutally beaten. But I was right there and saw the whole thing. But now, on the issue of Martin Luther King, there was a debate. There was not consensus. What should be said is this. Martin Luther King went to jail many times, so going to jail was not an issue for him. His house had been bombed with his wife and his baby there, okay? He had been a victim of many death threats and that kind of thing, so he was totally committed. So it was not out of a fear for Martin Luther King. He was on probation in Georgia. Because remember when Kennedy was running for president, Kennedy made the phone call that helped to get Martin Luther King off the chain gang because he had not changed his license when he moved from Alabama to Georgia. So that charge had nothing to do with the movement per se. It was extreme in giving someone 6 months because they didn't get their license changed, but that was the maximum. But had Martin Luther King got arrested on the freedom rides, he would have been off serving a sentence in Georgia. So you have to look at the practicality of it. Yes, but he helped. He was there at the mass meeting. He was the spokesman for the group. And so I was one of those who persuaded him not to come on the freedom rides because we didn't need him in jail. We needed him you know, on the outside helping to raise money to get us out.
Did it cause a rift with some of the other Freedom Riders that he wouldn't go since they saw him as serious protection? That
Yes.
a rift that would last for a while.
Yes, it did. And when you're in a situation like we were in, you need all the help you could get.